Listen, this is a huge privilege for me. Fionnuala and I go back a few years, many years. Fionnuala once worked in the same institution as I now work and continued to work, Ulster University, where she was an incredibly successful director of the Institute for Transitional Justice. And when I looked up her CV, I thought, actually, it's so long and so complex and so incredibly impressive that I thought we could be here, just me reading out the achievements. But just let me just say a couple of things. In 2017, Fionnuala was appointed as the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. Even the title itself is to put yourself right in the middle of some of the most contested issues. So this isn't, this is a academic who takes on really tough questions and really politicized questions in a really bold and courageous way. She is the University Regents Professor at the University of Minnesota and the holder of the Robina Chair in Law, Public Policy and Society, and a faculty director of the Human Rights Centre at the University of Minnesota Law School. And she's concurrently a professor here in Belfast at our partner institution, let's say, Queen's University of Belfast School of Law. Now, as part of just kind of starting our conversation, Fionnuala, and I can pronounce your surname really well, Aoláin, just to be clear. First of all, you're incredibly welcome, but just your history, what brought you into this space, in a sense, intellectually, but also personally? And what do you see as the key points that took you into this kind of very high public profile position in your own professional career?
Thank you, Duncan. It's lovely to be here talking to you, and lovely to have such lovely introductions and such a great wealth of support to the conversation. So I grew up in the west of Ireland. I'm a native Irish speaker from Spiddal, west. The next stop after Spiddal is Boston, if you start swimming. So I grew up in a community which was a minority Irish language community in Ireland. A community that actually historically on the island of Ireland has faced substantial discrimination. If you try to function your life as a minority language speaker on the island of Ireland, notwithstanding that there's a constitutional right to exercise your life through the medium of Irish, you find it's really difficult. And so I grew up in a household where my father was a language rights activist and a lawyer. And so we grew up with a sense of who we were in a place that where it was actually hard to function in your sort of through the integrity of your linguistic and cultural identity. My mother is from Northern Ireland. So as children, we spent much of our time in South Armagh on the Monaghan border. So those who know the borderlands of Ireland know how complex a place border is and what border signifies and what it means to inhabit border, both in a physical sense, but also in an emotional sense. So when I had to go to law school, at the time, there weren't many people from the Republic heading north, as Duncan knows. So as a 17-year-old, I headed to Queen's University Belfast to be a lawyer at age 17, which for my law students in the US seems extraordinary that anybody could be a lawyer at 17. But it was, of course, the height of the Troubles. It was 1987. It was the year where the Gibraltar happened in the spring of my first year of law school. It was a law school that was deeply divided, very sectarian. There were 3 rows in my law school class. The front row was where all the Protestants sat. The back rows were where the Catholics sat, and in the middle were the non-compliers. So I was in the middle. And that was actually a very narrow row. So actually people were very divided. Now there were places in Queen's that weren't divided, but actually sectarianism ran through the day-to-day. And so in my first month at law school at Queen's, I joined a small organization, which was just in the beginning of getting started, called the Committee on the Administration of Justice. We're a small human rights organization, and I think of it as my longest job. I have been in that organization since 1987 and have served on the board since my second year at law school. So that shaped me as a lawyer, and being at the heart of the human rights issues in the conflict from my very first months of learning to be a lawyer was really what shaped me, and that background in Connemara too. So
yes, and so because what comes across, I suppose, in all of your work is that this isn't just a disinterested thing. This is something that you are applying your mind to as a lawyer and as an academic, but you are motivated in this. So on this issue, obviously, counter-terrorism and human rights, in some sense or other, they exist in completely other worlds from one another. And in another sense, they are constantly in dialogue with each other because they have to be. So I
Thank you.
suppose, how do you see and how have you experienced the interface between those two worlds and between, you're now really dealing with the whole question of counterterrorism through a human rights lens? Has it been a welcoming world, or do you find yourself always having to, in a sense, be in a combative role?
Yeah, there's a lot bundled in there. I would say that, like, from starting when I went to Queen's in 1987, it is to understand that Northern Ireland actually was a jurisdiction for which counterterrorism law was one of the primary frameworks of regulation. We had the Emergency Provisions Act, the Prevention of Terrorism Act. So I often say to states in my current role, counterterrorism isn't new. I've known counterterrorism my whole life. And I knew it when I was a 6 or 7 year old and my grandmother was being stopped on a border for a car search, as we were traveling from one family home to another. So counterterrorism has shaped and defined Northern Ireland's existence since the inception of the state. It has also had this profound effect on the Republic of Ireland through the Offences Against the State Act, which was one of the first pieces of legislation that sort of defined the new Irish Republic as it became independent. So I've always seen counterterrorism as actually part and parcel of the legal system that I grew up in. And I suppose when I came to Queen's and I decided I was going to be a human rights lawyer early on, whatever that meant at the time, I mean, from the very beginning, working with the Committee on the Administration of Justice, it was the period of shoot to kill, where people were being killed by British Army and by soldiers and police. No accountability, no effective investigations, as the European Court went on to find. And the most exceptional law from non-jury courts through the gamut of the use of emergency powers to regulate every facet of daily life. So to me, counterterrorism and exceptional legal regimes have always been part of legal systems as I know it. And that's shaped how I think as a lawyer. And one of my earliest books, which is a book called Law in Times of Crisis, which was written right after 9/11, reflects really on the history of emergency powers and counterterrorism from the Greek and Roman period right up till the 9/11. So for me, these things are integrated. I think a separate question, and maybe we can reflect on that later, is what does it mean to be a woman lawyer or a woman special rapporteur working in this kind of legal environment? What kind of work does it do on you as a person to be a lawyer advocating for rights in a place which is actually pretty inhospitable to rights?
And yeah, I mean, and I think already you've touched on a number of things in terms of the kind of ways in which human rights interfaces with this, both as an Irish person, as a Irish speaker, as a woman, coming across all these things, that these are very real in the kind of exercise of power in your experience, as well as experiencing the Northern Ireland conflict and even the Southern Republic of Ireland law in terms of trying to manage or not manage or provoke terrorism. So I think the kind of realism of this needs to be emphasized. This is part of our common experience, I suppose.
Yeah.
What do you say to people that who argue that human rights law focuses on one side of the equation? In other words, and that counterterrorism, in a sense, focuses on the other side of the equation. In other words, and how do we bring those two? Is there a way to bring those two together, which is there's a legitimate defense of the state, but there's also a human rights imperative to keep that in priority? And how can these things be brought into any meaningful dialogue? You obviously, that's your job, is to somehow insist that they are. But I'm kind of interested in. It's such a huge issue, because people go into camps on this very quickly.
Yeah. I mean, I would start by saying security is a human right. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights, security, human security, the right to be secure in yourself as a person and the obligation of the state to protect you is a fundamental human right. And we cannot live as human beings and thrive and have dignity as human beings unless we are secure. So I don't see human rights as separate from security. I see security as embedded in human rights. And I think that's a philosophical starting point that many actually don't start there, but that is actually where it starts. The second thing I would say is that the act of terrorism or acts of terrorism, one of the biggest challenges we face, maybe to talk about separately, is we don't have a globally agreed definition of terrorism, unfortunately. We've had 30 years of a multilateral treaty on terrorism sitting in the 6th Committee of the UN. States don't agree on a definition. We don't have an agreed framework. And so each state gets to define on their own terms what is terrorism. So actually, if you're in China these days and you're a Uyghur, 1.5 million of your fellow compatriots are locked up as terrorists because they choose to practice their faith and their culture in a particular way. So the word has been historically used to enormous manipulation. And so that's one of the challenges as a lawyer that I see in this space, is that we lack an agreed definition so that we can clearly define what are unlawful, arbitrary, disproportionate, and human rights violated acts of terrorism against civilians, which is the core international definition that my mandate has supported and endorsed over 20 years, and what are other forms of activity that the state shouldn't be regulating through this prism. And the other thing I would say, and I mean, this is sort of fundamental to what I do, is that when you fight terrorism, and I think fight is an appropriate word, if you don't fight terrorism in a rule of law and human rights compliant manner, then I struggle to see what the difference is between those who are engaging in acts of violence and those who are responding by acts of violence. Meaning that particularly states who profess a commitment to the rule of law as a fundamental bedrock of what they do, their obligation, not just their legal obligation, but their moral obligation, is to fight terrorism consistent with the rule of law, not outside the law, because then you lose not just your international law basis to do what you're doing, you lose your moral basis. And maybe finally to say my mandate, which of course works on all of these issues, I have a profound and personal commitment to victims of terrorism. And when I became Special Rapporteur in 2017, I made the commitment that I would mainstream the rights of victims of terrorism through the work of the mandate. And there isn't a single country I go to or a place or context that I'm in that I don't meet directly with victims of terrorism and advocate on their behalf. And that's rights of victims. There's plenty of solidarity and supplication out there for victims of terrorism, and that's fine. But my experience of talking to victims of terrorism is that they deserve rights and legal process, that the things they want are not simply comfort, but they actually deserve the entitlements to medical and psychosocial treatment, to participation in legal process, to having the person who killed or murdered or harmed someone they loved held accountable for that act. So I see these things as connected. I don't think if we're on the side of victims of terrorism when we do counterterrorism work, we're not on the wrong side. And if we're on the side of people who've been killed or murdered by states in their counterterrorism activities, we're not on the wrong side. Being on the side of rights is never being on the wrong side.
So you wrote in your most recent report, and I'm exploring now with you that I accept and understand exactly what you're arguing for, that everything has to go into a rights framework, and then anything that's called terrorism or counterterrorism has to be assessed against that kind of a more fundamental frame.
Yeah.
But in your report, you commented, and I'm going to read it out. It says, resolutions, many containing expansive counterterrorism requirements for states, have failed consistently to recognize and specify the concurrent and complementary obligations of state under international law, including under international human rights law. And so what I kind of want to explore is the international community effectively turning up, and because obviously in the form of the UN, it's largely a forum for states.
Yeah.
Is it in practice turning a blind eye to the question of this fundamental obligation to deliver human rights in favor of another paradigm, which is to deliver whatever security means for each of the states in question?
So I think what I would say to that is we've seen in this report and previous reports as mandate holder that I've articulated, we've seen this fundamental shift in the regulation of terrorism since 9/11. That shift has involved a profound reordering of power within the UN. So the Security Council after 9/11, in a major resolution called Security Council Resolution 1373, it's etched into my brain, did two things. One was it started to act as a legislator on terrorism. So historically, the Security Council actually doesn't legislate for states. It sets out obligations. It speaks to the kind of broader role in peacemaking and peace enforcement, but it doesn't literally write national legislation for states, never has. Terrorism is one of the places where, in fact, Security Council departed from that historic practice and has become a legislator. And when I say it becomes a legislator, it writes Security Council resolutions in less than 6 weeks in a closed process in which primarily 5 states, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, write and agree things. And then they include the E10 if they're lucky along the way. It's not a transparent process. It's not an open process. It's not a legislative process that would be countenanced at any national level, but has come to define how we regulate terrorism. And remember, it comes in a context where there's no definition of terrorism. So it's creating these things for states to do, and then states get to decide who is a terrorist at the national level to whom these things will apply. The second thing we've seen emerge post 9/11 is this massive architecture of counterterrorism. Right below the Security Council sits this body called the Counter-Terrorism Committee, established under by UN Security Council Resolution 1373, and a number of adjacent bodies. And what that means is that actually this architecture, in my view, and what my report really speaks to, has been displacing and pushing out the peace architecture of the UN in ways that are contrary to the charter, if we take a kind of read of the UN charter, but also fundamentally displacing, I think, what we heard from Terry and others in introducing this, the more challenging, complex, difficult, long-term work of peace building. Because if you say to states, well, you have a choice, you can get this kind of do this fast kinetic thing called counterterrorism, or you're going to have to do this like long-term building work with communities, and it may be slow and stop and start, and it's going to involve all of these other kind of resources that you're going to have to put in at a community level. 9 times out of 10, what my report and other work is saying is we see them choosing the kinetic response. And the problem with that is that it doesn't work. Actually, let's leave aside the human rights piece of this. It actually doesn't work. We've seen 20 years of human rights light, civil society absent counterterrorism. And actually, if you look at global terrorism threats, they're increasing, not decreasing. So there's fundamentally something wrong with the way in which we've securitized peace. We've displaced the historic role that peacemaking plays in the UN Charter, and we've created a global structure of counterterrorism to do work that is mostly not effective.
Is that partly or rather, should I put it this way, implicit in that, have they changed at least in their own heads, what they mean by peace? In other words, peace is now effectively the elimination of threats to the established order, whereas peace in the UN Charter, certainly under the peace building regime and the Boutros-Ghali kind of initiatives in '92, is a much more expansive thing. And you've written it's actually symbiotic with human rights. So, in other words, that we've really kind of mutated the word peace to mean something quite different in the post 9/11 era.
Yeah. I mean, the report does, as you rightly said, it does this tracing on the kind of history of peace, which I think many on the call will be familiar with. And what I've seen is the stressors that have emerged in the last 2 decades in particular. So on the one hand, you have the peace architecture of the UN coming under enormous stress. And a good example of where that is happening is at the national level, countries like Mali, for example, where we've seen peacekeeping missions. There's a new nomenclature that's crept into peacekeeping as an example of stabilization. So what does stabilization mean? Well, in many cases, what stabilization means is that the UN security forces, the services are no longer the kind of neutral blue line in the middle, but are actively engaged in assisting the state to engage in counterterrorism activities. And places like Mali demonstrate what an absolute disaster. I was in Mali this summer on a working level country visit, and it's simply, I mean, not only is it not working, it's compromised the capacity of the UN to operate effectively in that space. And there's a reason why I spent a week in an armored tank, because UN officials can no longer move freely around Mali because it's not safe. Meaning that this pressure on the architecture is enormous, and it's counterterrorism pushing in. I liken it to a Pac-Man, you know, those old Pac-Man things that like it was a computer where they literally eat up everything. Counterterrorism is eating up the UN system. And the place where my report places the greatest emphasis is on budgets. So the Office of Counter-Terrorism in the United Nations, which was established in 2017, it's a kind of a rework of an older office, started off with 7 bodies on the ground, 7 bodies in the UN building. It has somewhere around 160 right now. So the thing to understand is that counterterrorism at the UN 20 years after 9/11 is not getting smaller. It's actually growing. It's taking up more institutional space. Look at the budget of the peace architecture. By comparison, the scale of the budget for counterterrorism in the UN is growing, and the scale of the peace architecture, including the Peacebuilding Commission, is diminishing. So what I say to member states is, you say you want peace, but actually what you're paying for is something else. So that tells us that you're actually not prepared to pay for peace. So in that sense, peace is being compromised because states are neither willing to pay for or put in place the resources to ensure or push back against the CT onslaught at the UN and beyond.
I was once at a meeting where somebody drew a distinction between counter-terrorism, where the emphasis in the language is its difference from terrorism, to the notion that it becomes counter-terrorism. In other words, it becomes extremely similar, if not in advance of that which it seeks to oppose. In other words, that it changes its in the language of people, it's a absolute polar opposite of that which it seeks to oppose. In practice, it becomes the mirror of the thing that it seems to oppose. Is that, do you think since 9/11 that's what happened, that to some degree has happened, that states have gone down the stabilization route, as you call it, the route of justifying stabilization first, but in fact have increasingly deployed methods which are parallel to, if not in advance of, some of the opponents that they seek to, if you like, eliminate or at least control?
I mean, I think we see a number of trends. I mean, the first thing to say is that part of the reason why that comprehensive treaty on terrorism is stuck in the 6th committee is because they can't agree that there can be state-sponsored terrorism. And as someone who follows much of these and who sees, for example, the support of certain states to non-state armed groups who are terrorists, then I am a firm believer in the capacity of a state to sponsor terrorism directly. We know that through countering terrorism, through financing terrorism, through enabling and supporting.
I always like to remember that the first use of the word the terror was the French Revolutionary State. It was the state.
So we know that, but what we also know, my mandate tracks patterns and trends in the use of counterterrorism measures. So in 2018, I issued a report to the Human Rights Council that tracked all of the communications of the mandate for almost 2 decades, well, a decade and a half. And what I found was that using the data of the UN itself, that 67% of my communications to states, so that's a direct letter from the mandate to a state party about its use of a counterterrorism measure, involved the use of counterterrorism measures against a civil society actor, meaning a human rights defender, a women's activist, a journalist, a priest, a practitioner of religious faith, somebody dissenting to their government. So actually what I see, what we've been tracking systematically is the systemic misuse of counterterrorism measures against civil society. I mean, 2 quick examples. Everyone knows the case of the woman Saudi Arabian driver who's locked up in Saudi Arabia for seeking to drive. Most people don't know that she was charged with terrorism, because that's the measure that was used against her. If we think about the six of the oldest human rights organizations on the planet, 6 Palestinian human rights organizations, Al-Haq and 5 others, all of them engaged in human rights work, including the women's committees of Palestine, have all been shut down by the Israeli government on the basis of countering terrorism finance. So what I see is systemic misuse. But we also see, and I think it's fair to say, if we look at the post 9/11 era, the era of rendition and torture, where systemically states and the leading democracy was engaged in the use of counterterrorism measure against individuals that mostly had no connection with the events that took place, murdering millions of people in New York. And actually, we have, I should say, thousands of people in New York, and harming those first-line defenders, those who went in as well, not just those directly hit in the Twin Towers. And again, we still have 37 men held in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, long-term arbitrary detention. So again, it's not to say there's an appropriate place for counterterrorism. The challenge for me as Special Rapporteur is that the currency of counterterrorism, and increasingly, I should say, the currency of countering and preventing violent extremism is deeply tainted. Whether it's the Chinese use of PCVE, whether it's the Russian and Caucasus use of locking up. I was in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan in recent years. And most of the people I was meeting in jails who had been locked up on the basis of extremism were people of faith, Jehovah's Witnesses and others. So for me, this space is so extraordinarily defined by abuse. It is very difficult to see those spaces in which we see counterterrorism work that's being done by states that is in compliance with the rule of law.
Do you, I mean, it is a kind of a two-part question. The first part question is, part of the question is just to observe that in making your proposals to the UN, certainly when it turns into a deliberating body, is a body of states. So at some level or other, the interests of states are represented and the interests of civil society are perhaps spoken about, but they may not or may not be represented. So is there a problem with the construction of the international architecture in relation to that the advocates for the non-state context, or at least parts of that, are simply absent? And the second part of that, coming on to that, is, you know, do you spoke a lot about language and the contamination of language and how in your reports and how words are taken to mean one thing, but in fact mean another thing. Do you think it's possible in the current architecture, given what I said at the beginning there, to rescue that? Do you see a way through this legislative quagmire, or do you think we have to almost begin a new language exercise and try to label things a bit more accurately?
Yeah, those are great questions, hard questions, Duncan. So what would I say about, well, you know, I would say, of course, like the people, the entities I work most with are states. My office engages primarily with states, and we seek to have good relationships with many states. And we have some of my best work is never done publicly. It's done privately in conversations with states. And I think I remain optimistic. And I would also say that the range of states that the mandate talks to is what generally often there's a view that, you know, we should talk to the Western and other states. But I don't take that view. I think actually many of the challenges are that we see systemic abuse of CT measures by many of those states. So there's a no clean hands philosophy in a way here. It's challenging, actually. So partly it's about dialoguing with states. I mean, there's a role for calling states out, and those of you who've read my reports or seen the work of the mandate know that I do that work in holding states to account before the General Assembly, before the Human Rights Council. I've been asked to brief the Security Council because of the mandate's work. And again, at that forum, when it's appropriate, I will say what I think needs to be said about accounting for states' violations. But I'm also of the view that where we can demonstrate good practice, we should try to do that. Like, it's a little bit like disciplining your children. If you only tell them bad news, they kind of switch off. So that's a very simplistic analogy for states. But I do find, and I think it's true, that constructive dialogue, that is sometimes an overused phrase, but it is important to have dialogue with states. And I have dialogue with all states, including some of the most difficult states, Russia, China, Syria, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Egypt. I talk to all of those states all the time. And so that doesn't mean that there are obvious changes on the outside. Sometimes the changes are slow and imperceptible. In parallel, the work of the mandate, particularly in the counterterrorism space, has been to encourage the inclusion of civil society. So when I became SOR in 2017, mostly the human rights work of the UN happens in Geneva. And actually states are pretty happy for NGOs to show up in Geneva, have their croissants and coffee and like corner them in a corridor. But where the real security work is done is in New York. And actually in the security space in New York, historically, there has not been a space for civil society, and civil society hasn't been welcome. And if you show up, there's often no one to greet you. So one of the things my mandate, and I personally have been pushing for, is the creation of space in security spaces in New York. And I think we've been quite successful in doing that and bringing grassroots voices of civil society into the New York space. And on your question of language, I use a phrase in the report around the decommissioning of language. And I'm particularly thinking of those places, to use a phrase that's sometimes used in Ireland, those thin places where actually complex conflicts are overlain, violence is cyclical, it's very difficult to kind of move because of the intractability of poor governance, limited socioeconomic capacity, increased climate change and climate impact that's driving resource challenges that are driving violence. And in those spaces, while it's deeply attractive to use the word terrorist to describe the group that's engaging in indiscriminate violence, my view is it's often unhelpful, meaning that when you use that word, you actually limit the capacity to undo the violence. You create a set of things that make those groups and individuals other, and not just them, but their families, their communities, their entire geographical spaces. We've seen that in Northeast Syria. We see that in parts of Mali. We've seen it in so many countries. We've seen it with Muslim minority communities in Western states who have been stigmatized and discriminated systematically by virtue of the association between a particular religious identity and so-called Islamic extremism. So again, I think this decommissioning of language is really hard. And I say, going back to victims of terrorism, it's hard. Because actually sometimes what victims will say is we shouldn't talk to them, we should punish them, we should not engage with them. And we know that states have consistently said we don't talk to terrorists. And you know, Duncan, and I know that that is not true. There is not a single country on this planet who says we don't talk to terrorists who doesn't talk to terrorists. And I know that intimately from the inside of watching those conversations. So there's a little bit of, and then what that does is it creates expectations for communities that when you actually try to speak to those who have been unspeakable to, that you're betraying them, that you're foregoing accountability, that you're not honoring the losses that they have. So this is a really, really hard space. But it does mean, in my view, that we have to rethink profoundly the language we use in the space and the consequences of using certain words that make the road to peace harder.
So rather than have an international convention on terrorism, would you start again?
So I fundamentally believe we need an international convention on terrorism. I'm actually one of the big proponents of that, because my view is define the thing. And actually the mandate I hold, and we've had at the UN Security Council in a Chapter 6 resolution has got close to doing it. It is not impossible to define terrorism. We have 19 sectoral treaties on terrorism. A definition of terrorism in a multilateral treaty is not impossible. It's actually super, I don't want to say it's super easy, but what's hard here is that it suits states not to have a definition of terrorism. It's actually deeply convenient for states. So I would say we need a definition of terrorism so we can hold states accountable to the rule of law. That's where we start. And we need a seriously pruned global counterterrorism architecture. And of course, resources aren't malleable, but we need to take some of the resources we currently have in kinetic, not working, not effective, not delivering solutions, and move them to the kind of long-term sustained work that we know works in communities. Frankly, and unfortunately, most states are not interested in that conversation.
You're preaching to the choir, of course. I suppose, the question of where does the reintegration of people who've been involved in, let's use for the language, terrorism, counter-terrorism, after community. So in Ireland, Northern Ireland, we tend to have evolved the language of former competence, but that's also a marshy space, that language. But I mean, the reintegration of people after peace building, are there some crimes which prevent this? What about the prosecution of people who've been involved in that? Is that a consideration, or is reintegration how do you see the process of reintegration of people who've been involved in these things within a peace building frame?
Yeah, so I think to say on accountability, I mean, the mandate has done, and my mandate has done an enormous amount of work on Syria and Iraq in particular, but not only. And I think accountability is an essential. If we have in particular serious violations of international law, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, you know, the lesson of Nuremberg is least we forget. We don't hold individuals accountable for serious crimes, then we permit impunity. And so for example, we've seen a number of governments, Germany is a good example, using jurisdictions like universal jurisdiction to hold former ISIL members accountable for the violations they committed during the caliphate. But there's a but, and you and I know this is really hard, Duncan, and we've seen it in places like Rwanda. You can't prosecute everybody. And that's deeply hurtful often. Yeah. And as a lawyer, I would say to you, when you have old cases, and in Ireland this week, we had a major prosecution of a young man who was killed on a border called Aidan McAnesby, and his family finally had a day in court. And that's super important for a family that's fought for, 30 years to get a day in court. But the reality is, as lawyers, we know you can't get everybody's day in court. And criminal justice systems, think of the genocide in Rwanda. You could not hold every single genocidaire accountable in a legal system that couldn't do it. So there's this fine balance, which is a really painful balance to be struck. But it doesn't mean that you compromise in saying that there can't be accountability. But the reality is that you won't have accountability for everyone. And so then we think about reintegration, which is essential, but it's super hard, as we know. People will often feel communities who've been harmed. I think about child soldiers, which is a category the mandate has worked with, children who have committed the most grievous violations. And then they're brought back into their communities. And on the one hand, that community can view those children who are often deeply harmed and by their own action as beneficiaries, unfairly so. And it looks like you get rewards for breaking the law, for doing the unacceptable, for flouting the conventions, norms, and values of a society. But if we don't do integration, if we don't do the hard work of reintegration, we know in Ireland, and in Northern Ireland in particular, that we commit ourselves to cycles of violence that will be repeated over time. This is what we know. So somewhere, and we have lots of, there's lots of practice on DDR across the globe. We've been learning how to do this for quite a long time. How do you do reintegration well? How do you support the communities, not just the individuals who are coming, but preparing the communities to bring back individuals? How do you create benefits for the community as a whole so that the individuals who committed these violations are not seen as beneficiaries? How do you use those individuals? How do they use themselves? We've seen it as transformers in their society. And it is often true that the people who have done the greatest harm can be extraordinary peacemakers. But all of this is deep and dark and painful work, and it's long-term work. As we know in Northern Ireland, you sign a peace agreement in 2018. We are a lifetime away from the fixing of our conflict. We just don't happen to be on the front page of the New York Times anymore.
No, absolutely true. And I suppose that maybe we haven't done the hard yards of taking this whole process further out. I'm listening to you and thinking, even in Nuremberg, it was literally a few of the most senior members of the Nazi party who had survived the war who were taken to court. Not all of them were found guilty or only of lesser charges. All of these things, they're very complex issues. In Yugoslavia, you were part of it yourself. Not everybody in Srebrenica who was involved in it was taken to court. That's the reality. But the senior leadership was taken to court, and at least it set down some kind of marker. And it's, in a sense, never enough. So that question of where it goes, I suppose that takes me to my last two questions. And I'm aware of the time, and I'm sure there's so many questions for people that have come up here. So we won't be any more than 10 minutes, just if people are looking at that. But in security, as you said, is the right, in your sense. It's also the language of counter-terrorism, this question of security.
Mhm.
And I suppose this goes to your observation that human security must be seen as the fundamental thing we're trying to protect here. But have we done enough to connect? I mean, I suppose in my question, there's almost an answer which is no, but how is better? How do we better connect this doctrine of security from the international security, from national security to human security? How is there a piece of work that needs to be done here? And is this, who should be doing it? Is it lawyers? Is it your office? Is it, how do we connect these things, I suppose, in a better way?
So in a strange sense, I feel like the work on, we had a Human Security Commission that reported, and I actually think that work, that deep dive work on human security has been done in the UN system. It's actually been done really well. And again, part of the mandate work, but also other actors in the system, is to not just talk about security in the narrow kinetic sense, but to talk about human security, which includes the right to food, water, shelter, human dignity. Those are all like tied up in a bundle of things that make for security. So it's actually when we start from, I mean, I'm mostly in security spaces. So what I try to do, and what I know others are doing in the space, is actually change the language of security from within those spaces, partly because it's in the self-interest of states to do so. It's actually, again, these narrow definitions of security are not serving states well. The kinds of violences we've seen in places like Iraq, Syria, Mali, the Sahel region, all of these actually result from an overly narrow understanding of what securities, in the plural, are needed to guarantee the absence of violence over the long term in these spaces. So I think as we talk, we do this work, we try to model this work. And I think the other thing, like, to me, there's a human rights piece to this, but there's like a very, I sound like a law and economics professor, but like, there's like a, is it working question? How is this working out for you, what you're doing right now? Because in fact, it's not working. And I think that discourse with states, I also really fundamentally believe that bringing grassroots voices into global security spaces is critical. You have to do that work locally. But if you're in the Security Council in New York and you are never hearing from grassroots activists in places like Mali, where you're renewing mandates for a peacekeeping unit, or in Libya, then you actually are missing something about what you're doing. And so part of the work here is actually closing spaces. It's also about investing in the multilateral system, which is under extreme and profound stress at this time.
Yeah, it's interesting because I suppose it's a challenge also to schools of international relations and international security, which we've all been in and part of, is how to frame them within a wider context. And I'm very kind of minded of the whole policy debate which goes on in a lot of places around outcomes-based accountability, and the outcome has to be in the human security space if you're measuring actual value, I suppose. I suppose as my final question, I suppose you've intimated a little bit about that formal legal processes can go so far.
Yeah.
We've been having dialogues with a number of people who've suggested that the legal frame gives people a kind of a definitional clarity and so on, but in the many communities, I suppose in the telling, I'm thinking of Liberia here, people are saying that actually it doesn't do enough to close the gap for people in local communities. So I suppose I'm thinking about how would we, without in any way taking leave of the fundamental basis of human rights, but extend the notion of rights into those kind of local spaces, but also is there a role there for locally, culturally embedded forms of practice to be somehow in dialogue with this question of human security and reintegration in a way that would open up the tools, but also begin to touch the real relationships which have been, in many cases, ripped apart by the violence that is, come to an end, but it's still remembered very deeply in the body of the community.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say for me, law is a necessary but not sufficient condition, right? We need law. Communities without law, I mean, go back to the basic social contract. Communities need law and legal certainty, but there are many parts of the world where law doesn't stretch. Like literally where legal systems don't function, where judges don't emerge, where the systems, like even I lived in Sarajevo for a period during the war where every courtroom was bombed, there was no electricity, like the actual infrastructure of law was missing. So we know this to be true, but we also know that, and this we see in customary and other practices from communities, people have a great desire for like capacities or procedures to settle disputes in their lives of different kinds. So that might be formal legal systems or informal legal systems or customary systems. And there is an important and absolutely essential role for that. The place where we struggle, and I say this as a feminist international lawyer, is that many of those local culturally embedded systems are deeply patriarchal and they're often antithetical to the promotion of women's rights and equalities. So it's an and but, it's an and but. And the question is then, how do we, in all of the work, including the work we do in security, how do we gender security? Like we've been talking about making secure human rights a bigger part of the counter-terrorism and security space, but also making gender identity and understanding the masculinity of these spaces as central to actually some of the ways in which they work. For those interested, and then I'll stop to questions. I issued a report to the Human Rights Council 2 years ago on the way in which counterterrorism is gendered. And that might be interesting reading for those who think about gender in these spaces. Thanks.
No, I think it would be absolutely. And I think it's a good way for you and I to end what I have found a really fascinating and incredibly interesting and provoking discussion about areas we have to go. I think I'm going to invite Terry to come and help us ask questions and see where the questions in the room are. And I'm sure there are a number of questions that have to be asked.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that discussion. And I'm going to draw on some of what you've already said and build up and ask some questions that'll probably build upon it. There seems to be a few clumps of interest. One is around justice and accountability. One that you've just mentioned, how do you gender security, women and families. There's some questions that have come up, and there are a set of questions around humanitarian aid and development. So I think what I'll do is just do it topical, and I'll say what the questions are, and then you can talk broadly about them. So Laura Dugan, who is with us here at Mershon, is doing a lot of work trying to understand the far right here in the United States. And she's looking at, for example, historical roots of white supremacy, the processes of radicalization here and ideological spread. So she raises this question: how much do you see this persistence in using kinetic counterterrorism tied to the political will of the leaders, given that aggressive responses are often framed as characteristics of a strong leader? And we saw that in the early 2000s here in this country. Do you think leaders know they are creating harm? Is there a way to make peace politically appealing to fearful constituents? So that's one question, set of questions under justice and accountability. Another set is raised by someone in the chat. Do you, oh, wait a minute, excuse me. Security and retribution at the governance level and seeking justice at the local level seem to be dominant approaches to justice around the world. When there have been significant violations and widespread justice, do these approaches balance the scale of justice? Where have you seen the most encouraging examples of seeking to do justice in a complex historical setting, and what characteristics? So tell us about some of those good practices and good CT activity that are examples that we might be able to follow. So there are a few questions right there.
Yeah, super interesting questions. So maybe just to talk a little bit about, so making just an observation on the far right, if we look at the Global Counter-Terrorism Index, which is the kind of annual, biannual index that tells us like the state of the world, at least in one snapshot, we see that one of the fastest growing areas of threat is right-wing terrorism. That said, it's worth noting that actually we have almost no, our global security architecture has almost no sustained interface with that kind of threat of violence. And the challenge here is that many of our populist leaders in many countries are leaning into the space from which some of that violence is emerging and percolating. So The challenge with one of the fastest and most complex areas of violence that's growing globally, whether it's Hindu nationalism or other forms of extreme right-wing extremism, is that we see very little political will to address it, because actually the nexus with what we might call mainstream political rhetoric is often very narrow in ways that mean there's no political will. In terms of making sort of the leader, I think one of the things, I was at an event earlier this week, we were launching some work around masculinities and counterterrorism, and looking at the role that masculinities play in constructing both terrorist groups, but also the response. And in many ways, these two things are actually mutually constructive. They have relationship with one another. They're not as different as one might think. And the challenge is that there's a particular model of masculinity that dominates the kind of the idea of what makes people secure, which is linked to what kind of mostly men or women who are highly masculine in the way in which they respond to threat do so. And I think this speaks to, and it doesn't give an answer, but it speaks to the need to think about the relationship between certain kinds of performative masculinities and security choices and security ordering. And I think feminist scholars have long been aware of that, but in mainstream thinking about kinetic security, we just actually see very, very little attention paid to that. Increased attention to what's happening in non-state armed groups, for sure, around recruitment in particular, but not a lot of attention to how state performance and security actor performance of masculinity ties into the kind of ordering that we're talking about. And good examples is just, I mean, people often ask me, surely there has to be a good example of counterterrorism. And I would say from both my predecessors, so there are two predecessors who held my role, and we've had long discussions about this. We don't find them. We don't find them. Take the USA Patriot Act. We could have a long discussion about the response post 9/11, not just what happened overseas, but what happened nationally. Think of the UK Prevention of Terrorism Act, or the new consolidated legislation in the UK that was passed in 2000, similar. Think about the PREVENT strategy in the UK, a strategy that essentially criminalizes Muslim children who are non-conforming in the school setting. Think about what's happening to Muslim French citizens in the application of administrative law in France. Think about what's happening in China. Think about what we've seen around countering violent extremism legislation. I would be really happy if someone could show me a good example of how this is working well, because I don't see it if we're talking about classic counterterrorism. And one of the key points that I make to states is we have no monitoring and evaluation of CT, none. So actually, if you want to find out what's working, then monitor it, evaluate it, and assess it. But the reason you don't have monitoring and evaluation, because actually we have an enormous problem with what's happening on the ground. So I wish I had better news. I don't. And that speaks to what I do see as successful are other strategies. So if we talk about prosecution, right, prosecution of terrorism, I'm going to give you an example from France, where in the aftermath of the V13, Vendredi 13, the mass killing in the Bataclan, and mostly of young people, many of those survivors whom I met on a country visit to France. And the French government chose to use its regular criminal law to prosecute those individuals. And it demonstrated not that you have to go to juryless trial or absence of upending the regular rules. It showed that you can, using your ordinary law, hold people accountable. So I would say that the examples we see of success in this space are when we use our regular, robust rule of law systems to hold people accountable for specific crimes in specific ways. That's what works. Maybe finally to say, countries where we've seen this balance between like the kind of top down and bottom up. I mean, with all its imperfections, both Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia speak to the commitment to trying to do this work at two levels. It's imperfect. Of course, it's imperfect. It's imperfect because the scale of the genocide in Rwanda was so egregious. It's imperfect in Bosnia because the political solution of the Dayton Agreement is barely holding that state together. So it's not about accountability, it's about something more fundamental. But that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile. I mean, the legacy, when we look at Nuremberg at the time, we would say, actually, that wasn't enough. Of course it wasn't enough. 6 million Jews and others were murdered. And we had like this handful of high-ranking Nazis, and then the rest of them went back to their day jobs or went to Latin America or wherever they went. Not enough. But that doesn't, like, whatever you do speaks to the value of holding, as Duncan said, this kind of line. And that's what we're doing. We're often just holding these lines and arguing for the virtue of them, even when they're imperfect.
I'm just going to interfere as we're interrupt. To say only that from Northern Ireland, and it doesn't count, it's never referred to as counter-terrorism, but I think our policing reforms were some of the most important elements in trying to turn the dial on the way the state related to its communities in a way which was still about security. And I think that there are some quite interesting elements of, if you like, state reform, if not counter-terrorism, which are within a space of trying to ensure security. So I just think there's some interesting examples in that for me, and that we're still working with it, imperfect, but nevertheless, compared to what was there before and in intent and philosophy, very interesting.
I mean, I agree with Duncan, but that's not a counterterrorism reform. That's an institutional reform around transparency, better management, and better accountability of a police force, right? It touches on security, but my point, and I agree, the line in, which also doesn't stigmatize the police, which tries to build confidence from the inward out and redefine. That's not counterterrorism work. That's a different kind of work. And the problem is we don't weigh and value that work enough.
All right, let's move on to another set of issues around women, children, and families. And so would love to step back and ask you to tell us a little bit more about how do you go about gendering security? So just drawing from that previous comment. Then our colleagues, Chris Bosley and Mike Darden from the VE unit at USIP raised the question that relates, I think, to your Human Rights Council January 2021 report, where you're looking at the practices on the rights of women, girls, and families, and also the report that you made to them in 2022, where you're asking for the immediate return and repatriation of third country nations being held in a variety of facilities and camps in the northeastern part of the Syrian Aryan Republic. So their question is, how is the UN continuing to work with international partners on the return and reintegration of women and children post-ISIS? What are the challenges? Why? And in your opinion, is this important? And then Donna Pankhurst, who is from the University of Bradford's MA program on development and peace studies. She wants to raise the question around children and children's soldiers, which you referenced very briefly, and or coerced youth, perhaps even conscripted youth, and questions of justice. Are children universally victims? And even if they are victims, what about the victims of victims? Again, you touched on this, but go a little deeper. What does justice require?
Super good. So how do we gender counterterrorism? Well, the first thing, I mean, my report is sort of talk to the kind of masculinity of the space. I mean, I have an all-female team, so all of my lawyers are women. And so I think one of the things that's always amazing is when we walk into the security spaces, whether it's dealing with intelligence services in a particular country or the military on a country visit, that there's always this stunning gap between who's sitting on one side of the table. And I think there's often a presumption that if you're a woman, I mean me, that you can't work, that you're somehow structurally disabled or unable to do the work. So I think that's really interesting, the presumptions that walk in with you when you're a woman. Sometimes they're helpful, actually, because what happens is they strategically underestimate you consistently. So that has its own benefits. But it is to say that so naming and the gendering of the space, the lack of queerness in the space, it's not just men and women, but the lack of LGBTQI representation, the broader lack of racial diversities and underrepresented groups in security spaces. We have addressed that in sort of sectarian ways in Northern Ireland, but if you look across security spaces, that broader lack of representation. when I think about like how to gender, I'm going to give one example of how the work we've done on gendering, countering terrorism. So countering the financing of terrorism is a fundamental priority for states. You want to stop money flows going into organizations or individuals whom you believe to be involved in terrorism or associated activities. But much of the work on that is actually kind of obscure, meaning it happens through processes of listing. The US, for example, uses terrorism listing. The UN Security Council has UN designated terrorist groups, so people are put on lists. The process is often opaque, it's non-rule of law compliant because you rarely know the evidence against you. And you have no capacity or very limited capacity to challenge your listing. So one of the things my team and I looked at when we did the report was we looked at the gendered consequences of listing, because while in many cases the person who's listed and named is a man, the impact of listing falls on the women and on the families that are associated with that man, many of whom live in societies where they don't have bank accounts, they can't alienate property, they have no independent means of working. So when you target the man, you're actually targeting the woman and everyone who's dependent on him. So by doing a gender analysis of looking at the impact of listing, which then speaks to finding ways, what you don't want to do is imperil those families or people who may have actually no responsibility for the acts that have been articulated, and actually working through the gendered consequences of listing individuals who have no capacity to access remedy, where there are no exemptions that allow family members to access basic survival needs. That's a gender analysis. That tells you where the cost is falling and that the cost has a gender dimension. And so you could do that across the board, whether it's detention, whether it's, no-fly lists, whatever it might be. Northeast Syria is a huge, I think, as USIP mandate has been heavily engaged on this issue since I took up office in 2017. We've issued communications. The mandate was the first UN entity to identify all 57 countries who had third country nationals held in Northeast Syria by issuing letters or communications and lists of numbers and names to all of the countries involved. And I think my position has been clearly that the return of women and children from Northeast Syria is an international law obligation for states, but it's also a security imperative, that the longer we leave women and children in those camps, the long-term securities in that region are undermined by having a mass site of arbitrary detention. 60,000 people held in arbitrary detention, most of them women and children, and the vast majority of the children are under 10 years old. Those children have done nothing except be born in that jurisdiction or be born to a parent who's been deemed associated with a non-state armed group. And the abrogation of responsibility by states, particularly Western states who profess themselves to be proponents of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, is simply like profoundly regrettable. We've seen some movement on repatriation. So the US, I think, is notable for its return policy. But its numbers are relatively low. We've seen countries in Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan bring back large numbers. I was in Uzbekistan. I was physically there for a country visit and was invited to observe the repatriation of over 500 women and children into Uzbekistan 3 years ago. And we've monitored really closely what that repatriation looks like. So repatriation is possible. It's in the best interest of the child. It is in the security interests of states, and the failure of states to engage in repatriation is just, it's sort of like every child has a right under the Convention of the Rights of the Child, except those kids. And so that's what we're seeing, is a pick and choose menu on the Convention of the Rights of the Child and the Children in Armed Conflict agenda by states who should know better. So we've been pretty stark in our criticism of states in that regard. And maybe to Donna, Donna, I love your work. I quote you regularly, so thanks for your question. The complexity of child soldiers. So increasingly we see non-state armed groups, including groups designated as terrorist groups, recruiting children. Sometimes that's done coercively. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes actually a rational choice for a parent in an area of deep insecurity is to hand your child over. And those of us who live not in those spaces don't understand that. But I think those of us who worked in insecure contexts know that sometimes people make tragic and terrible choices because the sort of securities as they present may not, are to say suboptimal is not true. I think it's very clear, international law is very clear in this regard, that children who are recruited, to use the words of the ICC statute, conscripted, enlisted, or used, should be treated primarily as victims of terrorism, in this case, are victims of conflict. In general, rehabilitation is the first option, and as a general matter under the Tokyo rules, that we view prosecution as the last resort. That doesn't mean that children should escape accountability, but I think it's fair to recognize that children who engage in those ages in violence, just as children who engage in violence in national legal systems under the age of 18, we recognize them often not to have fully developed frontal lobal cortexes and to be incapable of making good decisions. But it's complicated, as you know better than I, based on your work. And I think one of the things that I have been tracking in my work, two things that I think might be interesting to this audience. One is the way in which the boy child in particular is being stripped of protection in the context of terrorism discourses. So boys, by virtue of their gender, because they're male, and because they're of a certain age, are presumed to be combatants, whether they are or not. And there's a wonderful Palestinian scholar, Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian, who talks about the category of unchilding. It's a word I love because it speaks of the ways in which we deem some children not to be children. We've seen this in the United States when it involves young Black boys who are viewed as non-child by virtue of their age, their race, their gender. And so I think we have to resist this idea that categories of children are simply stripped of the right to childhood by virtue of the geography they're in, the age they are, or the sex that they are. And we, in particular, my mandate has been paying a lot of attention to what's happening to boys in Northeast Syria. And when people commit war crimes who are children or crimes against humanity, that's extremely hard. A good example, the first case before the ICC was the case of Thomas Lubanga. Many of you will remember that case. He was convicted on the charge of conscripting, enlisting, and using child soldiers. But Lubanga had been a child soldier himself. So it doesn't mean that, of course, we don't hold him accountable, but it speaks to the complexity of lives that are lived in these spaces, and maybe the lack of tolerance for understanding those complexities, which is not about not holding people accountable, but it is about seeing complexity.
Thank you. My mind, as you were speaking, I was thinking about just flashes of young men that I have met with over the course of the last 10 or 15 years who were 14, 15, 16 and being conscripted or being pulled into paramilitary organizations in Turkey and Syria and Afghanistan. And it is very complex. So thank you for, I have not heard of the term unchilding, and I like that word too.
I do too.
Yes. Last question, and this one will need to be brief. It has to do with humanitarian aid and development. Just curious how that kind of complex web of counterterrorism measures, legislation, regulation, donor requirements, even as a researcher trying to do research in Yemen, where some governments require that we take the IDs of people in those spaces before we can actually interview them. So tell us a little bit about how you've seen counterterrorism impact humanitarian development and research in these areas.
This is a huge issue. It's actually a really prescient question to ask, because right now the Security Council is deliberating a new Security Council resolution led by Ireland and the United States on what's called humanitarian exemption on exactly this issue. So those of us who are praying for an outcome that will be positive to enabling exemptions for spaces of complex conflict are going to be watching the Security Council very closely in the next couple of weeks. And it is to say that we know that counterterrorism requirements are deeply impacting humanitarian space. Impartial Humanitarian Action, the ICRC, International Refugee Committee, all of these organizations, Charity and Security Network, have all been documenting the negative impact. They've been documenting the impact on their contracts, on subcontracts, on the kind of guarantees that grantees are asked at the local level to guarantee that nobody who uses their services or gets anything is connected in any way with a terrorist group. Well, I mean, if you're living in South Sudan or you're living in anywhere outside of 37 miles outside of the capital of Mali, Bamako, your chances of engaging with a non-state armed group are pretty high. So in reality, what that's doing is cutting out the most fragile peace work from support. It's negatively and particularly affecting women human rights defenders and women humanitarians. And it's actually like a self-inflicted wound, because the negative impact of CT measures on the capacity to deliver humanitarian aid, engage humanitarian assistance of various kinds, including peace work, which is the Holder decision of the Supreme Court is particularly concerning in that it looks like it excludes peace work training from any exemption, is really worrying. So I'm staking a lot on this Security Council resolution that we hope is going to pass in the next couple of weeks that would create an exemption and would be landscape changing on this issue.
Do you know that perchance you know the resolution number?
It's not out. It's
not out yet. Oh, yes, yes.
They haven't passed it. They're negotiating it.
No.
But
all right.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to pass this over to Claire, but she is texting me that she's been having trouble with internet. So let me ask Claire, are you available? And if not, I'm quickly, Duncan, do you have a final thought or word that you want to say while we're waiting for her to jump back on?
I'll wait until Claire. Do you want me to say something now?
Yeah, because I don't know. She's struggling. She's been in and out of internet connection. So just hopefully she'll be able to join us.
I suppose my first response, I'm really delighted that we asked for this meeting today. I think simply the kind of coherence of what you've been saying and the importance of what you've been saying and the need to kind of give platform to what is being said here, I think is really urgent. The multiplication of stabilization and counterterrorism thinking across the globe in a way which constrains the higher imperative of human security seems to me to be a really important debate, but one that has to be held in a way which is consistent, because, as you say, there's no evidence that the world is becoming more secure as a result of counterterrorism. In a sense, actually, the last 20 years have shown us almost exactly the opposite. It seems to be that the states which have engaged most profoundly in counterterrorism find themselves locked into a spiral which has basically seems to escalate, but never actually reach any outcomes. And there's no question about that. So I think, just Fionnuala, thank you. I would like to say personally, I feel it's been an incredibly thought-provoking at one level, but also really interesting in terms of its practicality. That there are some really important debates which now need to be had and which need to be led. I will be very interested in how far we can get on a global definition of terrorism, because I think if we could even get that, even have the conversation in public again about what we mean by this and who it applies to, I think you're right, it might at least begin to shift the conversation away from simply as it's defined by individual states and used in an almost a very loose way into a way which brought us all back into a dialogue with human rights. So for your work that you're doing, I just think it's really important work, and congratulations, but also keep going. If there's anything that we can do, obviously we're always available. But on the second side, I think I'll take away some of your thoughts. If there's one other thing, I think it's about how this post-law, I've always felt this, I agree with you. Policy and legislation are essential, but they're not sufficient. There is something in this human security which is very intimate and it's very hard to put into legal frameworks, but also it's very complex. So I see Claire's coming on, so I'll come off. But I think that the way in which the principles underpinning what you're talking about then extrapolate into law and then beyond law is really a big question for us who are working not so much in the rights field, but in the engaged peace building field. Anyway, that's enough for me. And I see Claire sitting there, so I'll go off.
Just let me briefly say that Claire has been working extensively with Northern Ireland's executive authority, or not authority, but executive, which is their form of government, on paramilitarism and counterterrorism. So it seems really appropriate. We started with Ireland and Northern Ireland to kind of loop back and let her do a couple summary comments, and also to thank you, Fionnuala, for joining us today. So Claire, over to you.
Thank you so much, Terry, and everyone today. It's been incredibly fascinating and so thought-provoking for me. And we heard a lot about this macro picture of global counterterrorism and human rights today. And it's something that I see the macro version of the micro version of, I should say, in my day-to-day. So Fionnuala gave us a bit of a brief history of counterterrorism in Northern Ireland, how it was integral to shaping the state since its inception. And what I see in my work is the legacy of this. So the high levels of trauma in communities, the ongoing high levels of violence, the associated high levels of mental health issues our citizens struggle with, and a system which isn't always well set up to deal with these types of complexity. So we see the outworkings of this approach with pressures across the system. In Northern Ireland, we also have a bit of a strange situation where terrorism, however it's defined or not defined, remains an accepted matter, so the responsible of the UK government, but other forms of criminality, including organised crime, and the investigation of prescribed terrorist groups on ceasefire or paramilitaries are the responsibility of the Northern Ireland Executive. We also know that the drivers of these activities, as well as the potential solutions, including building resilience and capacity for individuals and communities, will be delivered by the devolved administration and our partners in the community and voluntary sector. So on top of the complexities we've heard about today, here we're also navigating sensitive and challenging constitutional boundaries, all without ministers in Northern Ireland at the moment. Fionnuala also mentioned budgets, and the programme I work on isn't unusual in that it's time-bound with limited funding. Our many partners rightly point out that sustainable long-term change requires sustainable long-term focus with associated funding. So we are very much focused on the long-term building work in communities that Fionnuala described, Duncan discussed. It is slow, it isn't consistent, and I have the challenging job of trying to monitor and evaluate our work in this field. In this, I have been delighted to be part of the international consortium looking at transitions from violence to peace for almost 3 years now. Terry mentioned some of our work to date at the start of this event, and in 2023, we will be continuing this work. So early in the new year, we'll be running another online learning platform considering global practices of rituals, rites of passage, and ceremonies, which can be transformative processes for individuals and communities transitioning from violence. We will also be considering the ethics of such processes, as well as hosting further discussions like the marvelously rich event we have been part of today. So I would like to extend my thanks to our partners, to USIP, the Mershon Centre, Corrymeela Community, Ulster University, and a special thanks to our speaker, Fionnuala Aoláin. Finally, thank you to you all for joining us today.